It happened in the sky, where silence should have meant peace. 30,000 feet above the ground, inside a jet that carried power and wealth, one voice cut through the polished air like a blade. A whisper. A curse. Jessica Miller, the flight attendant in navy blue, stood frozen at the center aisle. Her hand trembled against the leather seat as her words sank into the cabin like a slow echo. The man she spoke to, the one they called untouchable, lifted his head in shock. David Carter, billionaire, CEO, a man who had built an empire from steel and sweat, now watching as a woman who served him drinks just cursed him to his face. The jet fell silent. No clinking of glasses, no chatter from the executives. Even his wife, Kimberly Carter, covered in diamonds and disdain, leaned forward as if Jessica had just broken a law no one dared to name. The cabin's air shifted. The executives glanced at one another, their cufflinks catching the light. Who was this woman, and what gave her the courage to challenge the man they all feared? Jessica's voice was low, steady, but her eyes, those eyes held a storm she had carried for too long. Her words were more than insult. They were loaded with knowledge, with something she should never have known. David leaned back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. He did not shout. He did not demand her removal. Instead, he studied her, as though the curse had unlocked a secret only he could recognize, and in that silence, power shifted. Just a little, but enough for everyone in that jet to feel it. Because curses are not always words. Sometimes they are truths that can no longer be buried. If you've ever watched arrogance go unchecked, if you've ever seen injustice unfold and felt the weight of silence pressing down on you, stop right now. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, because silence doesn't protect anyone. It only feeds the very systems that humiliate, degrade, and erase people like Jessica. And if you choose not to subscribe, then at least go to the comments and confess why. Confess why, when faced with truth, you chose silence. Let the world see your answer. The jet hummed steadily through the night, its engines carrying wealth and power over a sleeping nation. But inside the cabin, peace was an illusion. All eyes remained locked on the man in seat 1A, David Carter. David wasn't just any passenger. He was the name printed across skyscrapers, the man whose company fed thousands of families, the black billionaire who had clawed his way from nothing into the highest ranks of American business. Every gesture of his carried weight, every silence, every pause could end careers. And now, his silence after Jessica's curse was heavier than thunder. The executives seated around him stiffened, men in gray suits and silk ties, each of them worth more than small towns. Richard Wallace, chief financial officer, leaned forward with a sneer. "Do you know who you're talking to?" His voice cut sharp, but David raised a hand, stopping him. Jessica's knuckles tightened around the envelope in her grip. It looked like any other folded document, ordinary, forgettable. Yet her grip on it was iron. She had boarded this flight with more than drinks and polite smiles. She had boarded carrying something no one expected her to possess. Across the aisle, Kimberly Carter shifted, her diamond bracelet sliding against the armrest with a soft chime. Her voice, cold and clipped, pierced the air. "She shouldn't even be here. Remove her. This is not her place." Not her place. The words echoed cruelly. Jessica didn't move. Her chest rose and fell in deliberate control, her jaw tight, her gaze fixed on David, not his wife, not the executives. She was staring at the only man in this jet who understood exactly what she was holding in her hand, and why. The cabin divided. Some of the passengers smirked, finding amusement in the audacity of a flight attendant challenging a billionaire. Others turned uneasy, shifting in their seats, sensing that this was no ordinary act of defiance. One of the junior staff whispered at the back, "She's going to lose her job for this." But no one dared say aloud what they were all thinking. What if she was right? What if Jessica knew something that could shatter everything these men had built? David Carter leaned forward finally, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes never leaving hers. He studied her like a man decoding an unsolvable puzzle. And then, with a calm that chilled the air, he spoke just 3 words. "Let her finish." And with those words, the rules shifted. What had been humiliation was now theater. What had been defiance was now testimony. She thought the humiliation had ended, that the worst had already been spoken. But the real battle was only beginning, because one of the most powerful men in America had just given her permission to speak, and nothing in that jet would ever be the same again. The cabin of the Gulfstream felt smaller than ever. The plush leather seats, the golden accents, the quiet hum of the engines, none of it mattered anymore. The air was sharp, almost suffocating, as Jessica stood there, her hand clutching the envelope like it was the only anchor holding her upright. David Carter's command, "Let her finish," hung heavy in the air, ringing louder than the jet's engines. His words weren't just permission. They were a test, a challenge, an invitation into dangerous territory where reputations were at stake and careers could vanish in a single heartbeat. The executives shifted uneasily. Richard Wallace's jaw flexed, his pride burning hotter than the whiskey in his glass. He leaned closer to David, whispering, "Sir, this is madness. We cannot allow—" But David raised one hand again, silencing him with nothing more than a subtle gesture. That single movement reminded everyone why David Carter was feared and respected in equal measure. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to argue. His authority was absolute. Jessica's eyes swept the room. She saw greed, she saw arrogance, but she also saw something else, a flicker of fear. Not in David, but in the men around him. They weren't afraid of her. They were afraid of what she might expose. Kimberly Carter crossed her legs, diamonds glittering under the cabin lights. Her voice was velvet over steel. "You think you're bold, don't you?" she said, narrowing her eyes at Jessica. "But you're nothing. You serve drinks and clean trays. You think that gives you the right to humiliate my husband? To speak to him like you matter?" Jessica didn't flinch. She lifted the envelope just slightly, enough for the edges of the papers inside to catch the light. Her voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. "I matter because the truth matters. And this," she tapped the envelope, "is something you cannot buy, silence, or bury." The words sliced through the room. The junior staff at the back froze, their eyes wide, their hands clutching trays they had forgotten to set down. One muttered under his breath, "She's done for." But his voice betrayed a tremor, the kind that comes when deep down you know the tide is about to turn. David leaned back in his seat now, crossing one leg over the other. His gaze never left Jessica, his expression unreadable, as if he were playing chess with an opponent who had made an unexpected first move. For the first time in years, someone had shaken his board. The plane felt divided now. On one side, Jessica with her trembling hands and fearless voice. On the other, a row of powerful men and women who had everything to lose. And in the middle, David Carter, silent, calculating, waiting. 9 minutes. That's all it would take for everything to collapse. She thought she had their attention, but what she didn't know was that the next words out of her mouth would do more than silence the cabin. They would ignite a war, and once the first secret slipped from her lips, there would be no turning back. The hum of the engines grew louder, or perhaps it only felt that way because silence had swallowed the room. Every gaze was pinned on Jessica. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but her grip on the envelope never wavered. David Carter leaned forward now, his elbows resting lightly on his knees, hands clasped together like a judge waiting for testimony. His eyes burned into her, calm yet unrelenting. "Go on," he said, his voice low. "You have our attention." Jessica inhaled slowly, Her training as a flight attendant had prepared her to serve champagne under turbulence, to smile at insults, to remain composed even as the walls of her world tilted. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, standing on the edge of her own destruction, with only the truth as her shield. She slid the first paper halfway out of the envelope. The corner caught the cabin light, exposing a signature at the bottom. The executive sitting closest stiffened at the sight. Richard Wallace's voice cracked like a whip. "Put that away. Now, do you have any idea what you're doing?" Jessica's lips curved into a faint, almost weary smile. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied. "And maybe, for the first time in my life, so do you." She pulled the paper free. Gasps erupted, though the younger staff couldn't yet see the words. It wasn't just paper, it was power. Proof of deals brokered in shadows, of names and numbers that weren't meant to exist. Kimberly Carter's hand shot out, her diamonds flashing as she tried to snatch it away. But Jessica stepped back, holding the document firmly out of reach. "Careful," Jessica said, her tone sharp. "One tear, and it'll only make things worse. You think this cabin is the only place this evidence exists?" The words hit like thunder. The implication was clear. If they silenced her here, copies would surface elsewhere. David Carter's eyes narrowed just slightly, but his lips tugged into something resembling a smile. It wasn't joy. It wasn't approval. It was recognition. Recognition that Jessica wasn't just another employee. She was a player who had entered his board. "You've been waiting for this moment," David said softly, almost to himself. Jessica nodded once, waiting, watching, and wondering how long people like you could keep hiding behind titles and money. The younger staff shifted nervously. Some looked at Jessica with awe, others with dread, as if standing too close to her might drag them into the crossfire. Richard slammed his palm onto the table. "This is blackmail," he barked. "Sir, we cannot sit here and let a flight attendant—" "Enough," David interrupted, his voice cutting through like ice. His gaze didn't leave Jessica. "This isn't blackmail. This is leverage, and I want to hear where it goes." The room stilled again. Jessica unfolded the paper fully, her hand steadier now, her voice firm. "This document," she began, "isn't the only one, but it's enough to expose a deal that could ruin careers. It names names, dates, amounts, and signatures. Signatures you can't deny." The executives exchanged glances, panic creeping in at the edges of their composure. Kimberly's lips pressed into a thin, furious line. And then, Jessica paused. She lowered the document slightly, letting suspense coil tighter, her eyes scanning the room like a hunter measuring her prey. She had the power now. With one sentence, she could shatter reputations, burn bridges, and even topple empires. But what she didn't know was that before the jet landed, someone else in that cabin would turn her truth into a weapon, and the first betrayal would come from the last person she expected. The paper trembled ever so slightly in Jessica's hands, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. She could feel it pressing against her chest like a stone, daring her to let the truth escape into the open. David Carter's gaze remained fixed on her, calm, calculated. He looked like a man measuring a storm, deciding whether to ride it or redirect it. But the others? They weren't nearly as composed. Richard Wallace's jaw was clenched so tightly a vein bulged in his temple. His eyes darted between David and the document like a cornered animal. Kimberly Carter tapped her nails against the armrest, each sharp click a countdown of her impatience. The younger executives whispered to one another, their voices low and frantic. Jessica drew in a breath, ready to read aloud when a sudden voice cut through the tension. "Stop. She doesn't have to read it." Everyone turned. It wasn't Richard. It wasn't Kimberly. It was Alan Reeves, the youngest VP on the jet, barely 35, still clinging to the illusion of loyalty and ambition. His face was pale, his words rushed. We can resolve this without airing everything. Jessica, you don't understand what you're holding. You think this is power, but it's a trap. For you, for all of us." Jessica froze. His tone wasn't angry, it was desperate, almost pleading. David tilted his head, studying Alan like a professor observing a reckless student. "And why?" David asked quietly. "Would it be a trap?" Alan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Because—" He hesitated, then blurted it out. "Because I gave it to her." The cabin erupted. Gasps, curses, mutters. Jessica's heart dropped. She hadn't expected this. Alan's betrayal wasn't aimed at her. It was a confession that flipped the room upside down. Kimberly shot to her feet, her diamond bracelet jingling as she pointed at him like a prosecutor. "You what?" she hissed. "You gave her? Are you insane?" Alan's hands trembled as he tried to steady himself. "I couldn't sit back anymore. I watched the deals, the lies, the cover-ups. I watched careers destroyed, people silenced, families ruined, all to protect this empire. And she was the only one who saw me, the only one who listened." Jessica's throat tightened. In that moment she realized the envelope hadn't just been her weapon. It was his too. Richard lunged forward, grabbing Alan by the collar. "You little coward." But David's voice sliced through again. "Enough." Richard froze mid-motion, his fist still gripping Alan's shirt. Slowly, reluctantly, he released him. David leaned back once more, his face unreadable. "So, one of my own trusted men armed the flight attendant, and now, here we are." He clasped his hands together. "What a fascinating game we're playing." Jessica glanced at Alan, her eyes wide, her voice barely a whisper. "You used me." Alan shook his head furiously. "No, I trusted you, because you're the only one who'd be brave enough to stand up. I knew you wouldn't stay silent." The cabin felt like it might explode. Every alliance was crumbling, every mask was slipping. She thought she was the lone rebel in the cabin. She thought she had uncovered the truth on her own. But now, betrayal had rewritten the rules, and what Jessica didn't yet know was that Alan's confession wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, because someone else in that cabin had already decided she wouldn't live long enough to reveal the rest. Alan confessed because silence destroyed him from the inside. How many of us are guilty of that same silence? If you believe truth is worth the risk, subscribe right now and write your country in the comments. Show Jessica, and every whistleblower like her, that if they stand up, they will not stand alone. But if you stay silent, history will remember that too. The confession lingered in the air like smoke from a fire that no one could put out. Alan Reeves slumped back in his seat, his chest heaving, his career crumbling before everyone's eyes. The others stared at him as though he had just detonated a bomb in the middle of the cabin. Jessica's mind spun. She had walked onto this flight thinking she was alone in her courage. But Alan's confession blurred the lines. Was he her ally, or had he only dragged her into a battlefield where she was now the first target? David Carter's face remained unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps even amusement. He thrived on chaos, and this was the kind of chaos that separated the strong from the weak. But not everyone in the cabin could stomach it. From the far end, a voice rose, low and sharp. "This has gone too far." It was Gerald Hunt, the head of security, built like stone, his voice gravelly from years of barking orders. He stood slowly, his suit stretching across his broad shoulders, and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. His every movement radiated danger. "You think you can play games with documents," Gerald said, his eyes locked on Jessica. "But you're not just threatening these men. You're threatening the company, the shareholders, the Carter legacy. That's not brave." He stepped closer. "That's suicidal." Jessica's grip on the envelope tightened. For the first time, she felt genuine fear crawl under her skin. This wasn't corporate panic or social humiliation. This was physical, immediate. Gerald wasn't bluffing. Alan sprang forward, his voice cracking. "Don't touch her!" Gerald's lip curled. "Sit down, boy. You've done enough damage already." The other executives watched in silence. Not one of them moved to stop Gerald. Not one of them spoke up. Silence was safer than siding with the condemned. Jessica's heart raced. She could hear her own breath. The walls of the cabin seemed to press in tighter. But then, David Carter's voice cut through the tension. "Gerald." The head of security paused, glancing back at his boss. David's tone was calm, but each word landed with precision. "You will not lay a hand on her, not unless I say so." Gerald's jaw tightened. He stepped back, but his glare promised this wasn't over. Jessica exhaled, but relief didn't come. She had been spared for now, but the message was clear. Every second she held onto that envelope, she was living on borrowed time. And in that cabin, surrounded by men who feared exposure and a woman who despised her existence, she realized something chilling. If she made it out alive, it would only be because David Carter allowed it. She thought Gerald was the danger, but what she didn't know was that the real threat wasn't standing at the back of the jet. It was seated just a few feet away, smiling behind diamond rings, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jessica's pulse still thundered in her ears. Gerald's shadow loomed large, even as he reluctantly stepped back under David Carter's command. But in the corner of her vision, another threat stirred, one far more subtle, far more dangerous. Kimberly Carter. She sat perfectly composed, one leg draped elegantly over the other, her diamond bracelet catching the cabin light with every deliberate movement. Unlike Gerald, she didn't need brute force. Her weapons were sharper, influence, manipulation, and venom delivered with a smile. Her lips curled as she leaned forward, speaking not to Jessica, but to her husband. "David, darling, are we really entertaining this?" Her voice dripped with disdain, silk over steel. "A flight attendant holding our future hostage? Do you not see how absurd this looks?" David didn't answer. His silence only deepened the tension. Kimberly's eyes flicked toward Jessica, cold and calculating. "You think you've found power," she said, her tone rising now for the whole cabin to hear. "But what you're holding isn't truth. It's a curse, because the moment you reveal it, you'll destroy more than reputations. You'll drag yourself down with it. You'll be nothing but a scandal, a name chewed up and spit out by the media." Jessica's throat tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "Maybe, but at least I'll go down telling the truth." Kimberly smirked, as though she had been waiting for that response. Slowly, she reached into her designer purse. The room stiffened. What was she pulling out? Not a weapon. Something far deadlier. A phone. With a flick of her manicured nails, she opened the camera app, raising it just slightly as if testing angles. "Let's see how long your courage lasts when the world watches you fall apart in real time," Kimberly whispered. Jessica's stomach dropped. Kimberly wasn't threatening to stop her. She was threatening to weaponize her. To turn Jessica's moment of bravery into a viral spectacle that would frame her not as a hero, but as an unhinged employee humiliating her employer at 40,000 feet. Alan lurched forward. "You can't do that!" "Oh, I can!" Kimberly snapped, her eyes flashing. "And I will! One live stream, and her story becomes my story. And trust me, people will believe me over a flight attendant." The executives murmured in agreement, nodding, some even smirking. They knew how easily narratives could be twisted when money and status were on one side of the screen. Jessica's grip tightened on the envelope. Her mind raced. If Kimberly went live, her truth would be drowned before it was even spoken. David finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Kimberly." She glanced at him, her manicured finger hovering over the screen. "What?" "Put the phone down," he said simply. The room froze again. Kimberly blinked, stunned. For the first time, her composure cracked. "You can't be serious." "I said," David repeated, his eyes narrowing, "put it down." Kimberly hesitated, her jaw tightening. For a moment, Jessica thought she might refuse, might defy even her husband. But slowly, With a hiss of frustration, Kimberly lowered the phone and slid it back into her purse. The cabin exhaled as though it had been holding its breath. Jessica's heart pounded harder. For reasons she couldn't yet explain, David had just protected her again. But was it protection or control? She thought Kimberly's live stream was the danger. But what Jessica didn't see was the silent nod exchanged between two men at the back of the cabin. Because while Kimberly's phone was put away, another plan had already begun. And this one wouldn't stop at humiliation. The cabin had shifted again. Kimberly Carter sat back in her seat, lips pressed tight, her pride wounded by David's command. She had been silenced, for now. But power never disappears. It only changes hands. And while all eyes had been fixed on the confrontation between husband and wife, something quieter, deadlier, had already begun in the shadows of the jet. At the far end of the cabin, two men leaned subtly toward each other. Richard Wallace, the CFO whose empire of numbers was at stake, and Gerald Hunt, the head of security who had already made his threat known. Their exchange was brief, almost invisible. A glance, a nod, a flicker of understanding. Jessica didn't notice it. She was too busy steadying her breath, clutching the envelope as though it were a lifeline. Alan kept whispering at her side, urging her not to let go, not to give in. But across the aisle, plans were already being laid that would ensure neither of them ever made it off the jet the same way they had entered. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the engines. "She won't last the flight." Gerald's eyes didn't move from Jessica, but the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "I'll make sure of it." The deal was struck without signatures, without paper. It was a pact carved out of desperation, whispered in shadows, sealed with intent. And in the world of men like them, such pacts were more binding than law. Meanwhile, David Carter studied Jessica like a specimen under glass. He was curious, not just about the documents, but about her resolve. How far would she go? What would she sacrifice? What hidden strength had given a flight attendant the courage to face a cabin full of lions? Kimberly, still seething, leaned closer to her husband. Her voice was low, dripping venom. "You're playing with fire, David. She doesn't belong here. She never did. End this before it goes too far." David's eyes never left Jessica. "Too far?" He almost smiled. "No, Kimberly. This is where it finally begins." Jessica shivered. His words weren't meant for her ears, but she heard them anyway. And though she couldn't explain why, they felt less like protection and more like prophecy. The envelope in her hands suddenly felt heavier, not just because of what was inside, but because of what was now building around her. She had stepped into a battlefield where allies and enemies shifted like shadows, where one wrong move could end not just her career, but her life. And still, she held on. She thought she had bought herself time, but what she didn't know was that two men at the back of the jet had already decided her fate. And before the jet touched down, their pact would force her into a choice no one should ever have to make: surrender the truth, or pay the ultimate price for keeping it. The Gulfstream's cabin felt smaller with every passing second. Jessica gripped the envelope, her palms damp against the paper. She could feel the shift in the air, not turbulence but something heavier, more suffocating, the kind of weight that comes when choices are about to be forced. Richard Wallace finally broke the silence. He leaned forward, his voice smooth but venomous, the kind of tone that had closed billion-dollar deals and ruined lives with equal ease. "Miss Turner," he said, his eyes narrowing, "let's stop pretending you have power here. You don't. What you have is a very expensive accident waiting to happen." Jessica's spine stiffened. "If you think threatening me will make me fold, you've already lost." Richard smirked, but before he could respond, Gerald Hunt shifted forward, his massive frame blocking out the light. He spoke in a low growl meant only for her ears, though the whole cabin leaned in to catch his words. "You have two choices," Gerald said. "Hand over that envelope now, or this jet will land with one less passenger." Jessica's breath caught. For the first time, the threat wasn't veiled. It was raw, explicit. Her heart hammered, but her grip didn't loosen. Alan shot to his feet. "You lay a hand on her, and I swear," Richard snapped, his patience gone. "Sit down, Alan. You've destroyed yourself already. Don't make her mistake your coffin, too." The younger executives looked away, their eyes fixed on the carpet, unwilling to intervene. Kimberly smirked from her seat, her silence saying more than words ever could. She didn't need to speak. She wanted Jessica cornered, humiliated, begging. Jessica forced herself to breathe. In, out. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. "You say I have two choices," she said softly. "But you're wrong. I have three. I can hand this over, I can go down fighting, or I can make sure every single name on these papers is in the hands of people who will destroy you before this jet even lands." The executives stiffened. For the first time, they realized she had thought further ahead than they imagined. David Carter's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something darker, satisfaction. "There it is," he murmured, "the backbone no one expected." Jessica's pulse pounded, but her words poured out now, each one sharper than the last. "You want to silence me? Fine. But know this, the truth will not die with me. Because long before I stepped on this jet, I made sure it was already in motion. And when it surfaces, every one of you will be exposed." Richard's face drained of color. Gerald's fists clenched, but hesitation flickered in his eyes. Kimberly's smirk faltered for the first time. The ultimatum had been flipped. Jessica was no longer just defending herself, she was forcing them into a corner. She thought they would back down after her defiance. But what Jessica didn't realize was that desperation makes the powerful even more dangerous. And in the next 9 minutes, someone in that cabin would gamble everything, reputation, power, even blood, to silence her for good. The jet's engines hummed steadily, but inside the cabin, the calm was gone. Jessica's words still hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. For the first time, Richard Wallace wasn't in control. His empire of fear had wavered, and that shook him more than any threat could. "Enough of this!" Gerald Hunt barked, his deep voice thundering as he lunged forward. His massive hand reached toward Jessica's arm, aiming to rip the envelope from her grasp. But at that precise moment, almost like fate intervened, the jet jolted. A sudden tilt sent glasses sliding off tables, ice clattering onto the floor. Executives gasped as the sleek aircraft dipped, forcing everyone to grab onto something. Jessica stumbled, but clutched the envelope tighter. Gerald's grip missed by inches, his hand slamming into the leather armrest instead. Alan caught her by the elbow, steadying her. "Don't let go," he hissed under his breath. Kimberly let out a sharp laugh, her voice carrying above the chaos. "Look at you all, scrambling like children on a playground, a flight attendant holding the mighty Wallace Corporation hostage. Pathetic." Richard snapped his head toward the cockpit. "What's happening up there?" he barked, his voice cracking with the first hint of panic. But no answer came. The cockpit door was sealed, and the pilots were silent. Jessica felt her pulse hammer against her ribs. The tilt wasn't violent turbulence. It was deliberate. Someone up front was making a choice, and it wasn't one that favored Richard Wallace. David Carter leaned back, his eyes gleaming with something close to admiration. "Looks like your pilots have a conscience, Richard." Richard's face turned red with fury. "Or they've been bought." The jet steadied, but the damage was done. The illusion of control had cracked wide open. Fear spread among the executives like wildfire. They weren't used to uncertainty. They weren't used to being pawns. And in that crack, Jessica saw her chance. She raised her voice, louder than she ever had before, her tone cutting through the panic. "You all think you're untouchable, but right now in this sky, you're not CEOs. You're not billionaires. You're passengers, and I'm the only one who can land this truth safely." For a moment, the cabin froze. Even Gerald stopped moving. But Kimberly wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her words dripping with venom. "You're not a savior, Jessica. You're a liability, and liabilities get eliminated." And with that chilling statement, Kimberly slid her hand into her designer purse. And when she pulled it out, Jessica realized this fight wasn't just about words anymore. What do you think Kimberly just pulled out of her bag? Was it money to bribe Jessica, a hidden recorder, or something far more dangerous? Drop your guesses in the comments right now before the next chapter reveals the truth. And don't forget to subscribe, because the jet hasn't even reached its deadliest altitude yet. All eyes locked on Kimberly as her manicured hand slipped slowly from the purse. The leather bag dangled at her side, and the anticipation was unbearable. Executives leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats. Jessica's grip on the envelope tightened so hard the paper bent beneath her fingers. Alan stood close enough to intervene, his eyes darting between Kimberly's purse and Jessica's face. Then she pulled it out. Not a gun, not a knife, but a small silver voice recorder, its red light blinking steadily. Kimberly smirked as she held it up for everyone to see. "Oh, don't look so disappointed. You thought I'd resort to something crude? No, Jessica. I don't need weapons. I only need your own words." Jessica's heart dropped. She realized Kimberly had been recording since the beginning. Every insult, every declaration, every threat, it was all stored inside that tiny device. Richard's eyes widened. For once, the mask of arrogance slipped, replaced with alarm. "What did you just say?" Kimberly turned toward him with a sly smile. "Insurance, Richard, because while you think you own everyone in this room, you never owned me. And when this recording hits the right ears, even you won't have enough money to buy silence." The cabin erupted into chaos. Gerald cursed under his breath. David let out a low whistle, almost amused by Kimberly's audacity. The executives whispered frantically, trying to gauge where their loyalties should now lie. Jessica's mind raced. The power had shifted again, and this time not in her favor. Kimberly had just introduced a weapon more dangerous than money, the truth captured in her own voice. Alan leaned close, whispering urgently, "You need to get that recorder. If she controls the narrative, everything you fought for is gone." Jessica swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her fight wasn't only with Richard anymore. Kimberly had set herself up as judge and executioner, and the jury was the world outside the jet. Richard slammed his hand against the armrest, his voice booming, "Give me that recorder, now!" But Kimberly didn't flinch. She pressed the button, and Jessica's own voice crackled through the cabin speakers. "You all think you're untouchable, but right now, in this sky, you're not CEOs. You're not billionaires. You're passengers, and I'm the only one who can land this truth safely." The sound of her words echoed in the pressurized silence. Jessica felt the weight of the entire cabin pressing down on her, and yet, beneath the fear, there was something else. Resolve. Because Jessica knew one thing Kimberly didn't. There was something far more damning than a recorder hidden inside this jet. And it was about to surface. The cabin was tense, the recorder still blinking in Kimberly's hand. Every second felt stretched, like the air inside the jet was thinning. Jessica's pulse pounded as she scanned the faces around her, searching for the smallest crack in loyalty. Alan shifted beside her, whispering, "We need to take her down before she releases more." His voice was urgent, protective. But then, something in his tone, something too sharp, too rehearsed, made Jessica's stomach twist. Slowly, she turned her head. Alan wasn't looking at Kimberly. He was looking at Jessica, and then it hit her. His hand wasn't steadying her anymore. It was holding her wrist in a vice-like grip. Jessica tried to pull away, but his fingers dug in deeper. "Sorry," Alan muttered under his breath, his eyes suddenly cold, stripped of the warmth she thought she'd seen before. "But this isn't your fight. It never was." Her heart lurched. Betrayal. From the one man she thought was on her side. Richard noticed instantly, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Finally, someone with sense, Alan dragged Jessica toward the center aisle, forcing her to stumble forward. The envelope nearly slipped from her hand. Gerald stepped up, ready to snatch it the moment she faltered. Kimberly laughed softly, her recorder still flashing. "Oh, Jessica, you thought you could play in their world? You thought you could win? No, you were always just a pawn, and pawns are expendable." Jessica's throat burned with rage, but she refused to let them see fear. "Why, Alan? Why pretend to help me?" His jaw tightened, and for a split second, guilt flickered in his eyes. "Because if I didn't, you would have never opened the door this wide, and now, it's done." But as Alan wrenched the envelope from her hand, none of them noticed the faint hum growing louder from the cockpit. Something was happening up front, something no one could stop. Alan's betrayal stung like fire, his grip crushing Jessica's wrist as he yanked the envelope away. Kimberly's recorder blinked in her hand, ready to capture Jessica's humiliation. Richard leaned back in his seat, smug, convinced the game was won. But then, over the murmurs and the cruel laughter, another sound broke through, a low, steady hum, followed by a click. Then, the unmistakable crackle of the intercom. Every head in the cabin snapped toward the speakers overhead, and a voice, calm, clear, unshaken, filled the jet. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. For too long I have flown men who believe the sky belongs to them. Today, that changes." The cabin went still. Even Kimberly froze, her finger hovering over the recorder's button. The captain's voice continued, "This flight is no longer yours to command. It belongs to truth. And in 9 minutes, the world will hear it." Jessica's heart pounded. 9 minutes, the exact amount of time in the story's title. She wasn't imagining it. The countdown had begun. Richard shot to his feet, his face pale. "What the hell is this? Who told him to say that?" David Carter chuckled darkly, his eyes narrowing. "Looks like the man flying your jet doesn't fly for you anymore, Richard." Jessica's gaze flicked toward the sealed cockpit door. She had no idea who the captain really was, but the way he spoke, the conviction in his tone, told her one thing. He knew. He knew about Richard, he knew about the Empire, and he was ready to bring it down. Kimberly regained her composure, forcing a laugh. Empty words, the pilot's bluffing. But Gerald's massive frame shifted uneasily. He doesn't sound like he's bluffing. Jessica seized the moment, her voice rising. "You see? Even the skies are against you. You can control money, power, even people, but you can't control conscience, and you can't control truth." Alan's grip faltered, just for a second, just long enough for Jessica to wrench free. She stumbled back, clutching the envelope once more. But as Jessica caught her breath, the captain's voice returned, this time colder, sharper, and with a command that would split the cabin in two. "Choose your side, now, because when we land, only one side will walk away untarnished." The cabin was suffocating with silence after the captain's words, "Choose your side, now." Every executive glanced at the other, calculating, weighing their loyalty against survival. Gerald's fists clenched, his instinct screaming to stand with Richard. Kimberly's smirk faltered, but she gripped the recorder tighter, as if that little device could shield her from the storm rolling in. Jessica's chest heaved as she stood, envelope pressed to her chest, eyes scanning the faces before her. She wasn't begging, she wasn't pleading, she was daring them. David Carter, ever the opportunist, broke the silence first. He rose from his seat slowly, like a man shedding old skin. His voice carried with it the weight of resignation, yet a glimmer of hope. "I've sat at Richard Wallace's table for years. I've watched him bury truth with contracts and crush people like ants. I won't do it anymore." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Gerald barked, "Sit down, David. Don't be a fool." But David stepped closer to Jessica, his eyes locking on Richard's. "She may not have money, she may not have power, but she has something you can't buy, Richard. She has conscience, and I'd rather crash with that than land with you." Jessica's throat tightened. For the first time, someone in that room had chosen her. Kimberly's laugh broke the tension, high-pitched and sharp. "You're all pathetic. Choosing the flight attendant over the man who built empires. Don't you see? Without Richard, none of you exist." The captain's voice crackled back onto the intercom, colder this time. 8 minutes. Decide. Your silence will count as loyalty to the guilty. Executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sweat dotted Gerald's brow. The weight of the decision pressed harder with every second. Richard's voice cut through, laced with rage. "All of you remember who signs your paychecks. Don't let this little show trick you into suicide." Jessica's voice, trembling but steady, answered, "You all know what he's capable of. Ask yourselves, when this jet lands, will you be proud of the side you chose?" Her words hung in the air, and slowly, painfully slowly, another executive stood. Then another. 3, 4, 5. One by one they crossed the aisle until nearly half the cabin stood with Jessica. Richard's jaw tightened, his empire crumbling before his eyes. "Traitors, all of you." But as the last executive rose to choose, the lights flickered, and the captain's voice returned with a revelation that froze everyone in place. "You think you're choosing sides, but the truth is, one of you has already chosen betrayal, and I have proof." The cabin was locked in silence. The hum of the engines felt louder now, like a drumbeat counting down. Executives shifted nervously, their alliances shaky, their faces pale. The captain's voice cut through the heavy air once more. "You believe the choice is yours, but it's already been made, because one among you sold the rest before this flight even left the ground." Jessica's heart slammed in her chest. Her eyes darted toward Alan. His betrayal still burned, but something in the captain's tone made her hesitate. Could it really be him, or someone else entirely? Richard sneered, trying to mask his unease. "Don't play games with us, Captain. If you know something, say it." There was a pause. Then the voice returned, colder, sharper. "David Carter." Gasps exploded across the cabin. All heads turned toward the man who had just bravely stood by Jessica's side. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. No, that can't be." David stood frozen, his confident mask slipping. His hand twitched at his side, and suddenly, everything made sense. The way he'd risen so conveniently, his speech so rehearsed, his timing too perfect. The captain's voice delivered the blow. David Carter leaked the flight plan. David Carter ensured this confrontation would happen in the sky, where no escape was possible. He played both sides, and he thought no one would ever know. Jessica's stomach dropped. Betrayal upon betrayal. David raised his hands, his voice desperate now. "It's not what you think. I was forced. Richard has leverage on me. I had no choice." Richard's laughter rang out like glass shattering. "And you all thought he had a spine. Look at him, crumbling like the coward he's always been." Jessica's anger boiled. "You stood beside me, David. You made me believe you cared about the truth, and all along you were setting me up." David's eyes pleaded with hers. "Jessica, listen, I didn't betray you. I betrayed him, Richard. I wanted the world to see who he really is. The captain twisted it." The executives murmured, torn, their faith cracking. Kimberly leaned back with a satisfied grin, her recorder still glowing red. "Oh, Jessica, even your allies aren't allies. How does it feel to know you're utterly alone?" And in that moment, while accusations flew and alliances shattered, the jet suddenly dropped 20 feet in a violent jolt, throwing passengers against their seats. The captain wasn't done playing his game. And with just 7 minutes left, Jessica realized survival wasn't guaranteed for anyone. The jet rattled violently as it dropped, trays clattering, glasses shattering on the carpet. Screams erupted from the executives, their polished calm replaced with raw fear. The cabin, once a throne room of power, now felt like a cage falling from the sky. Jessica gripped the headrest in front of her, forcing herself steady. Her knuckles whitened around the envelope she refused to let go of. Richard shouted over the chaos, his voice cracking with fury. "Get control of this damn jet!" But the captain's voice thundered back through the speakers, calm and merciless. 6 minutes. And still, you cling to illusions. Money won't land you safely. Power won't keep you from the ground. Only truth will decide who survives. Gerald, rage boiling, lunged at David, his massive hand colliding with the smaller man's chest. "You snake! You endangered us all." David stumbled back, arms raised. "I didn't plan this. I was trying to—" His words cut off as Gerald's fist slammed across his jaw, sending him crashing into a seat. Jessica cried out, rushing forward. "Stop it! Don't you see? You're doing exactly what the captain wants, turning on each other." But it was too late. The cabin had become a battlefield. Executives shoved past one another, some scrambling toward Richard, others toward Jessica. The aisle, once polished and clear, was now a war zone of shifting alliances. Kimberly stayed seated, her recorder lifted high like a queen holding court, her smile unnervingly calm. "Go ahead. Tear each other apart. Every word, every punch. It's all being captured. And when this jet lands, I'll own the story." Jessica spun toward Alan, desperation in her voice. "You know this isn't just about me anymore. If we don't stop them, nobody makes it off this jet alive." Alan's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat she saw conflict in his eyes, the shadow of doubt. He was a betrayer, yes, but maybe not completely lost. Richard, towering above the chaos, bellowed, "Enough! She started this. Take the envelope. End it now." Gerald turned from David, blood on his knuckles, and barreled toward Jessica like a charging bull. The others watched, frozen between fear and hesitation. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She braced herself, the envelope clutched to her chest, nowhere to run. And just as Gerald's massive hand swung down toward her, the cabin lights flickered, then went black. For a terrifying heartbeat, the jet was plunged into darkness. And in that silence, someone screamed. The cabin was swallowed by darkness. The roar of the engines was the only sound, until that scream split the air. High-pitched, raw, filled with terror. For 3 endless seconds the passengers were blind. Hands flailed in the blackness, seats creaked as bodies shifted, and the faint scuffle of shoes scraped against the floor. Someone shouted, someone gasped, and then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the light snapped back on. Jessica blinked against the glare. Her eyes darted across the cabin. Gerald stood frozen mid-strike, his hand halted inches from Jessica's face. His eyes weren't on her. They were wide with shock, locked on the far side of the jet. Kimberly was no longer sitting smugly in her seat. She was on the floor. Her designer purse was overturned, lipstick rolling across the carpet, and the silver recorder lay just out of reach. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. Blood trickled from a small cut along her temple. She had been the one who screamed. Jessica's chest heaved as she tried to process it. Kimberly had been untouchable just seconds ago, calm, in control, certain she owned the narrative. Now she was sprawled on the floor, shaken, exposed. The executives whispered nervously. Gerald stepped back, unsettled. Richard's face twisted with rage, not at her injury, but at the loss of control. "What happened? Who did this?" Jessica's eyes caught something small but unmistakable. A hand retracting, quick as lightning, from Kimberly's shoulder. Alan's hand. Her stomach dropped. Alan had shoved Kimberly in the darkness. But why? To silence her? To protect Jessica? Or to seize the recorder for himself? The captain's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unyielding. 5 minutes. And now you see. Truth is fragile. One moment it shines. The next, it's crushed under desperation. Choose wisely, passengers, or be consumed with them. Jessica crouched quickly, scooping up the recorder before Kimberly could reach it. The tiny device was still blinking, still recording. Her voice trembled as she whispered to herself, This could be the key. Kimberly lifted her head, eyes blazing with fury, but too shaken to stand. You'll regret that. Jessica clutched the recorder and the envelope now, both weapons, both dangerous, and for the first time she realized she held more power than anyone else in that cabin. But as she rose, both treasures clutched in her hands, Jessica noticed something she hadn't before. A faint red light glowing above the cockpit door. A light that meant one terrifying thing. Someone had already started transmitting everything happening on this jet. Live. Jessica's breath hitched. That faint red glow above the cockpit door wasn't just a warning light, it was a signal. The private jet's internal system was no longer private. Somehow, somewhere, someone had tapped into the onboard cameras. Every word, every scream, every revelation could already be leaving the cabin, spilling into the world beyond these clouds. Her heart pounded as she clutched the recorder tighter. She thought of New York, of Wall Street, of the networks hungry for scandals, of millions of people glued to their phones. If this was being streamed, then her name, her face, her choices were already out there. Kimberly staggered to her feet, holding onto the leather seat for balance, her voice cracking with fury. "Turn that thing off, now! Do you hear me? Shut it down!" Gerald moved toward the cockpit, but the captain's voice returned, colder than ever, filling the air like a judgment from above. Too late. You wanted to play with power. Now power watches you. Every truth, every lie, every betrayal. The world sees it all. The passengers froze. Even Richard, the CEO who once barked orders as if the world bent to his will, was silent. His empire, his image, his carefully crafted dominance, all of it could collapse in a matter of minutes if the wrong clip reached the wrong ears. Jessica's fingers brushed over the recorder's play button. Her voice was a whisper, but sharp enough to cut the silence. Then maybe it's time the world knows the truth. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Kimberly's eyes widened with desperation. "No, you don't understand. If you press that, if you release what's on there, you won't just destroy Richard. You'll destroy yourself." Jessica's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" Kimberly's trembling lips curved into a faint, broken smile. "Because you're not just a flight attendant, Jessica. You were never just that. Tell them where you were 5 years ago. Tell them why Richard kept you so close, even while humiliating you. Go on. Tell them your secret." The words struck like lightning. The executives shifted uncomfortably. Alan leaned forward, eyes narrowing, suspicion darkening his features. Jessica's throat went dry. Her grip on the recorder faltered for the first time. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted again. Because if Kimberly was telling the truth, then Jessica wasn't just a witness to Richard's downfall. She was part of the very empire she wanted to expose. And if the world found out, she might burn with it. What do you think Jessica's hidden past is? Was she once tied to Richard's empire in ways she can't admit? Or is Kimberly bluffing to regain control? Comment your theory. The cabin had fallen into an eerie silence. Every eye was fixed on Jessica. The recorder in her hand no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like a mirror, reflecting a past she had worked so hard to bury. She straightened, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as if the very walls demanded her truth. 5 years ago, I was on Richard's payroll, not as a flight attendant, not as staff. I was part of his legal team, the one that covered up scandal after scandal. I wrote the clauses, I buried the evidence, I protected him, until the guilt nearly killed me. And when I walked away, I swore I would never be silent again. That's why I'm here. Gasps broke out. Alan whispered something under his breath. Kimberly's smug grin faltered, realizing she had given Jessica the stage instead of silencing her. Jessica lifted the recorder, pressing play. Richard's voice, commanding, cruel, undeniable, filled the cabin. "Get rid of her. Fire them all. I don't care how much it costs. No one humiliates me and walks away untouched." The words weren't just damning, they were catastrophic. The captain's voice boomed again through the speakers. "The world has heard. The broadcast is complete." Richard collapsed into his seat, his empire unraveling mid-air. Kimberly clawed at her pearls, but even her voice shook with despair. "Do you know what you've done, Jessica? You've destroyed us all." But Jessica stood taller than she ever had, her words calm, resolute, final. "No, I didn't destroy us. The truth did. And for once, it won." As the jet descended toward New York, the glow of city lights rising to meet them, everyone on board knew the landing would not just be a return to Earth, it would be a reckoning. Richard would face investigations. Kimberly's influence would wither. The executives would scatter like leaves in a storm. And Jessica? She would no longer be the silent one serving drinks in the aisle. She had become the voice the world could not ignore. But as the wheels touched the runway, one question lingered in the minds of all who watched the scandal unfold. Had justice truly been served? Or was this only the beginning of a larger war between truth and power? What do you believe? If you believe Jessica was right to risk everything, subscribe right now and state your country in the comments. Show the world you stand with truth. And if you think she went too far, explain why in the comments below. Because history is watching, and your silence will tell its own story.